Thank you, everyone, for joining me on another episode of Next in Queue. My name is Rob Dwyer, and this is the podcast about customer experience and contact center professionals. And today, we are definitely joined by a customer experience professional. This episode's going to be a little bit different. Thank you for joining me, Shanna Hayes. How are you?
I'm doing well today, Rob. Thanks so much for having me.
So you are an adjunct math professor at snhu.edu, Southern New Hampshire University, which is a little bit different than most of my guests.
That is very true. Yes, from what I have gathered through my research, and I've listened to a couple of previous episodes. So yes, definitely a different flavor today.
Yeah, so I'm very excited about that. And so we're going to talk about some of the things that you are doing in the CX, or maybe you even call it the LX space, learner experience. But first, I want to, as I typically do, kind of start and back up and find out where you are originally from. Are you from New Hampshire originally? Is that home?
Oh, it is home now. I am not originally from New Hampshire. I am a transplant. That being said, New Hampshire is one of those interesting states where a lot of folks who have been born in New Hampshire do not ever leave. So it's an interesting place to be if you did not grow up here. So I actually grew up in upstate New York, so about an hour north of the capital, which is Albany.
So
and I went to college in New Hampshire and have never left, to be honest. So I went to undergrad out here, and then I taught high school math for a handful of years before I moved into higher ed.
Yeah, so you are definitely a Northeastern. That's
Yes.
home.
Yes. New England with New York gets lumped in there because I grew up in the Adirondack Mountains. So essentially the same environment as New Hampshire, very foresty and a lot of trees and all that stuff. It's not New York City-esque, as a lot of the folks when I went to college were very confused about why I did not talk like I was from New York because of geography.
Yeah, I think those people that are not familiar with the Upper East Coast, most of us, when we think of New York, we think of New York City, and that's all we think of. And there is no other New York outside of that. But it turns out there's actually a lot of New York outside of that.
It is not just the people that are not from New York. If you ask anyone that lives in or in towards New York City, anything that is not the island or the city of New York in a borough is considered upstate. And so I have had some wild conversations about like, oh, you lived in upstate, like whereabouts? And you could get anything from just outside of New York City to Buffalo to the Canadian border. And I'm like, these things are like 9 hours apart. Like, how did we get this classification system? So it's always a very interesting conversation, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure. So aside from math, I believe you must have a sports passion, because I was surprised to see that you got a master's in sports management. And I think this is probably centered on a sport in particular. Is that the case?
That is true. So growing up, I played ice hockey my whole life. And so when I was teaching high school math, the state of New Hampshire does not require, when I was teaching anyways, I'm not sure the standards today, just to be frank, but when I was teaching, you was not required to have a master's degree. But the way that the pay scale is, as in most states, it's kind of the charted matrix system. So kind of the vertical is the years of experience you have in the classroom, and the horizontal line is your education degrees and credits and kind of all of that stuff. And so if you do have a master's degree, you get in most districts, a substantial pay raise. But at that point, it didn't matter what the degree was in. It was you had to have a master's of sorts. And so I didn't want it in education because that's what my undergrad was. And a lot of the coursework that I had explored in various programs was very similar to the courses that I had taken in undergrad. And my undergrad program, I loved greatly, and I hold it near and dear to my heart. But I'm also a human that wants to make sure that I'm getting value out of the courses that I'm taking in. Really don't like repetitive things. So I said I want to do something different and something that's going to be fun. And so I chose sport administration. and got that at SNHU, ironically, before I started working there full time. So I did pay for it out of pocket at the time, which is always like this kicker that I have now. But yeah, so I did a lot of work through that program. I studied a lot about the Olympics because that was always really fascinating to me. So I learned a lot about the Olympics and kind of how that process works for bidding on holding them and what that does to economies and stuff. So that was really fascinating. So now that I kind of have that background, it's really interesting to think about when they come around every few years.
Yeah, this year's Winter Olympics, to me, I almost feel like they didn't happen because I've just not paid any attention to them. I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's the time difference. I don't know if it's just the weird thing with not having spectators there for the Olympics, or if I just don't care at this point. I don't know, but I feel like this is the first Olympics where I'm like, I couldn't tell you what really happened, honestly.
Yeah, I will say because my fiance and I both work from home and we have 2 dogs, and so they bark at a lot of things. So if you hear them, apologies in advance to everyone. But we always have the TV going. And so when the Olympics were on, we just had that on in the background rather than some other, ESPN or the news or whatever we chose to put on that day. And so we got a lot of random sports that I probably would have never put on without needing to have some noise on in the background. So we watched a lot of curling, and we learned that the monobob is a new sport for women in the Olympics this year, which I was like, I've never heard of this. It's a 1-woman bobsled. I was like, oh,
Okay.
Is this a new thing? And then I was like, oh, they just said it's brand new to the sport, to the Olympics this year. This is fascinating. But I did have a lot of late nights and early mornings with the time difference for some of the US and Canadian hockey games. So that was interesting and caused for some much needed coffee and caffeine the next day.
Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, curling has always been the one that just gets me. And I lived in Minnesota for a couple of years, and obviously it's popular up there, but I just don't really understand why that's so exciting. But you know what? I grew up in Kansas, and I don't get hockey either. But people that grew up north, like, hockey is a religion. It's very different. I'm a baseball, basketball, football kind of guy, and I like hockey live. I really do, especially if you can get close to the glass. It's really exciting, really visceral. But I just can't do it on TV. It's just not my thing.
Fascinating. Yeah, see, I would say the same thing about baseball. Like, I would go to a baseball game, but watching baseball live for me, or like watching it on TV, it's got to be a really exciting game for me to keep my attention.
I understand. That's pretty common, I think.
Yeah. But yeah, so hockey was kind of the motivator for the master's degree outside of the desire to get a pay bump while I was teaching high school math, because I'm sure it's no surprise to most people that teachers don't make millions in most places. And so that pay raise was really significant at the time of my life.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
So you're at SNHU now, and I think for the Americans in the audience, you'll probably recognize that school, even though it's not a school known for athletic program, or right. It's certainly not something you're gonna recognize because they've got a great football team or basketball team. For the viewers outside of the United States, I'm sure you don't recognize it, but SNHU is it's a private university, but it's also a nonprofit university. And they do a lot of advertising nationwide. And part of the reason is because they've been in the online learning space for a really long time. So have you been involved in any of that online learning space since you've been there? Because they also have a campus, and it's brick and mortar like a traditional college. So how have your classes fit into that pre-COVID? And then we'll talk about kind of what happened.
Sure. Yeah, so I've had an interesting trajectory at SNHU. So I'll back up real quick and hop back into hockey for a minute here, Rob. So I actually stopped teaching high school math because I sustained a traumatic brain injury while playing ice hockey. And so through that process, I needed to find a new job that did not require me to do math at the time, because that was one of the things that took the longest to come back, was my basic math skills. And so I was in my early 20s and having this crises of, I just spent, $250,000 to do this thing that I, like most teachers think they're going to do forever. And now I can't do it for at least the time being. And so I needed to find a new role. And so I applied to a bunch of things that were very random, like being the warehouse retail manager at the Nike outlet, and was told I was overqualified. And it was this really awful time in my life, to be honest. But the best thing to come out of that was I actually received an offer to work as an academic advisor at SNHU in their online space. And so academic advisors in our online division, which now known as Global Campus, formerly known as COCE, which is the acronym for the College of Online and Continuing Education. So if there's some folks that have known SNHU for a bit, they may have kind of heard the former. So I actually was on the phones with students. I had a caseload of students that I managed, all of their kind of academic progress, retention of those students, working towards graduation requirements, any issues, problems, etc. I was kind of their number one point of contact, similar to what I would relate to a CSM or a customer success manager in our kind of corporate world. And then through that, I did that for about a year and a half or so. And then I said, I want to do more things, and I think I can think a little bit bigger than this. And so then I actually took a role working in our brick and mortar traditional campus, which is much smaller and serves, since the pandemic, our numbers have gone down slightly, which is true for most, traditional kind of residential institutions, but we average about 3,000 students on campus.
Okay.
And so I've been on campus now since the fall of 2017 in a variety of roles. I organized learner support for our engineering STEM programs, and then I rolled into a new initiative to support kind of the transformation and how do we offer programs that are less financially burdensome for students. So how do we decrease the cost, not only for us to provide them, but also for students to attend, so they're graduating with less debt, so to reducing that debt to income ratio. And then to your point, the pandemic showed up, and that initiative went from a team of 4 to a team of the entire university is now embarking on kind of this larger initiative to kind of move the work forward in a much more profound way and kind of set the stage for other institutions hopefully to follow suit kind of in the future. And so through that, I received a new role at the institution as the director of customer experience and retention. So really focusing on leveraging those best practices in our customer support and customer experience kind of areas and in corporate friends, and how do we bring those in, and merging those with some of our student experience practices and stuff. And so it's definitely a new idea, a new flavor, which sometimes education has a hard time with, as we know, but it's also really exciting. So that's the quick answer to your question.
No, that's great. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think that what drew me to want to bring you onto the show was actually this new role that you have. And it seems like that I have not seen universities really up until maybe recently be embracing this idea of customer experience, learner experience, and focusing on things in a way that kind of what we've seen in the corporate world, and you have just jumped headlong into that. And so I find that fascinating. And I do think too that there are so many choices now because online learning has become more and more popular. But I think what we've all seen is sometimes you may be forced into that.
Yeah.
And if I don't have to physically move to be on a campus, my choices grow exponentially. So how do I differentiate myself?
Right. I have more access to more options. Right. So it's now my choices are no longer these 3 schools that are within 20 minutes of where I live, because I don't want to have to pay for housing or to
Right.
live in the dorms, for example. So yeah, so the pandemic definitely exacerbated some of those pieces. And I think, SNHU has been online now for decades. And so that program has certainly been through a lot of renditions, but they are a well-oiled facet of our industry, right? And so our ability to kind of pivot was certainly different than a lot of our counterparts. And so we actually, with our incoming class, we were one of the few institutions that did not bring students back on campus until the fall of 2021. So we were remote for a year and a half, likely because we were financially stable enough to not need the increased tuition and increase in the room and board rates that other institutions likely needed to survive, right? So I realized that that decision also comes from, while it is a safety measure for us and for our students and for our, all of the folks that work there, such as myself, also coming from a place of privilege for a lot of institutions didn't have that ability because they needed the funding and those kind of dollars coming in from their students in order to make ends meet. And so what that looked like for us was certainly different than a lot of institutions, right? So we pivoted like everyone else did in March of 2020 and moved everything remote. Our full-time faculty, ran remote courses for the end of that semester. And then kind of the fall 2020 semester through spring 2020, our incoming first year class actually kind of took a hybrid is probably the wrong word, but that's the word I'm going to use in this moment. So we actually bridged for one of the first times our online and campus modalities. And so our incoming first year class actually took courses out of our fully kind of already robust and stood up online course catalog. And we orchestrated kind of edits to those to make sure that they were appropriate for the majors that they were pursuing and kind of making sure that they weren't going to get off track or behind in all of those things. And through that process, we did a ton of work in terms of merging some of the support systems in place, because previously they had been separate entities. So like the advisor you get on campus would be different than the one online, and the how you would access student support that you'd get on campus would be different than how you access it online. The kind of the back end of the website would be different if you were a campus student or an online student. And so there was a lot of back end IT work we needed to do to kind of figure out how we were going to make it all work with the way that students were coded in our systems. And so I was able to serve as the kind of the lead project manager through that process. And so that was fascinating. And I learned a lot about so many systems that I didn't even know existed, to be totally honest with you. But I met a lot of really great people who all jumped in to say, like, how do we make this work at a time in which there wasn't another option, right? The option was this, or we don't bring in an incoming class because we can't not do this the right way. And so I'm really grateful to work for a place that is always going to put the students first, and kind of through that process that has then kind of turned around and landed this new role, and kind of what that looks like moving forward, and how do we rethink some of our learner experience initiatives, and what does it mean to truly put the learner at the center of those decisions, and what do they truly care about, right? Because in education, to your point earlier, we don't ask a lot, right? We focus on the business specific KPIs, our key performance indicators. Are students graduating, which is important, and we need to report that to various entities for accreditation and financial aid and all of that stuff. As well as, like, are they retaining, are they persisting, are they succeeding in their courses, but are they enjoying that experience? Are they satisfied with it? Have they noticed, is it difficult to access our website, with measuring those very as my colleagues would likely say, corporate-esque kind of measures, such as your net promoter or your customer effort score, which sound like business jargon to a lot of folks in education. But when you really break it down and think through what that means for our students, no, they shouldn't have to get a form signed by 7 people who you can't tell them what time of day they're going to be in their office and when they can go get the form signed. Like, why is that the process and why is that necessary? There's got to be a better way to do that. It's just the way that it's always been, and we've never collectively prioritized the need to make it better, right? And so the position has really been about, what do we do now? Where do we kind of assess and collect any voice of customer, or the term we've kind of settled on is voice of student or voice of learner feedback to date, and then how do we look at that data and what do we do with it? And if those questions are not effective, or the answers to those questions are not effective in terms of we don't do anything with it, or we don't actively use it to then go back and make adjustments to improve the experience, well, how can we ask these questions in a better way? Or working with some of our teams who truly their whole role is building out those student surveys or those kind of mechanisms to collect the feedback. What are you trying to ask, and what do you want to know, so that we can work with folks who can actually design the questions in a way that are going to get you the information that you need, versus having someone in this office design a survey with the best of intentions, right? But like, I'm not a survey designer. That is not my level of expertise. And so if I design a survey, it's not nearly going to be as good or as unbiased as someone whose sole responsibility and his sole role and his expertise is in kind of survey design and making sure it's unbiased and asking questions in the right way and that type of thing.
Yeah, it seems, number one, that a university may have some advantages in the variety of the type of experts that it has within at its disposal in those types of things. But I wonder too, when you look at things from a customer experience standpoint, are you looking at things differently between the on-campus learner and the virtual learner? And what kind of different things are you looking at when it comes to that? Obviously, for a time, there have been a lot of people that are just doing things virtually, but what's different, and kind of walk us through kind of your thought process. Is that a whole separate exercise? Do you combine the two? What happens there?
Yeah, so essentially I will share that our global campus folks are a little bit ahead of where campus is with some of the CX work that they've been doing. So they kind of embarked on this process before us. So they're definitely ahead of us. But to answer your question, Rob, it is definitely an aligned exercise, but two very different subsets of populations, mainly because the factors that influence that student feedback are very different. The students that are attending our online population or our online programs, they are taking those from potentially their workplace, or they're taking them from the library or their home dinner table, or what that might be, right? And so they are solely with SNHU for their academics. And so their overall experience is solely academic. And then obviously we have some learner support systems, we have advising, financial aid, the basics, packaging, and then we have some student clubs and orgs that students can join online. But if we think of kind of our traditional median campus student that we would see in our residential campus, the majority of them physically live on campus and are residential students. So the things that impact those students, it would impact kind of the triggers that would either raise the alarm or raise the celebratory bell, like things are going great, are drastically different, right? So when we run, an annual survey, or we run the VOC kind of mechanisms that we pull, the answers we get from campus students are drastically different because the levers that influence them are so different, like the dining hall services or the facilities that they use, or the COVID-19 restrictions or requirements that we currently have in place, because they're all things that don't impact our online population in the same way, because they're physically not here kind of with us in front of us. And so it's a very different exercise. And then also, I will share, just for kind of context, the way that students enter either of those spaces, either campus, obviously, they would both typically enter virtually in terms of kind of how they would apply to us, is very different, just because The majority of students that come to campus are the traditional aged, kind of right out of high school student. We do have non-traditional students, excuse me, and a small population of students who are attending, who are veterans and are attending with military benefits, that type of thing. That being said, our online population, we do have a substantial number of students who do come right out of high school, but we also have a majority of that population is your kind of working mom, dad, or older age student. And so the mechanisms in which are in place for the applications of both of those two things are drastically different. And so we participate on campus in the common application, which is essentially an application students can fill out and have it sent to multiple kind of traditional residential institutions on campus, versus online is a separate kind of application process. It's just different.
Yeah, it's almost two entirely different products, right? I mean, the end result, that diploma, sure, that's kind of what you're paying for, and certainly from an online, you're paying for the learning experience. But as an on-campus student, you're paying for more than just a learning experience, right? It's the living experience.
Yeah, I think it's, we're just kind of delving into identifying some of those customer performance indicators for our campus students, because really why our campus students is here might be drastically different than why our online students kind of show up or attend our online programs, right? So if I'm an online student, I can be doing this because I need it to get a promotion at work, or I need it to keep my job at work, right? Or I need it to change career fields, or I need it to, X, Y, and Z. Whereas if I'm, 18, the reason I'm attending SNHU on campus could be one of those things, likely is not, right?
Right.
So that's certainly a hypothesis that I have. I'm not writing the survey, of course. That being said, kind of identifying and better understanding why our students are here will help us better understand what those expectations are and how we can meet them, and then be able to measure if we are meeting them or not, and then kind of put some safeguards in place to then react and glean some of those insights to then kind of act on those, that feedback.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things after I had talked to you about being on the show that came to my attention, and then I think it kind of went a little bit viral on Twitter, was this challenge that I don't remember what school this was at, but they had this challenge where they had stashed $50 in some locker and had put the instructions on how to retrieve this money at the end of their syllabus. And then they kind of threw out, well, nobody reads the syllabus, obviously, because my $50 is still there. Whoever wanted it could have come and claimed it had they read the syllabus. And I think kind of the general reaction was, well, these, kids are lazy. They don't read the syllabus. You tell them what to do and they don't do it. But I wonder, from a customer experience standpoint, what you thought about that situation and what questions it sparked for you.
Sure. Yeah, so when I read the article that you're referencing, I had a lot of thoughts and feelings, of course, but I will share a lot of the work that we have done at SNHU is talking about the verbiage that we use, and understanding kind of where students are when they show up, and really meeting our learners where they're at. And so if I remember correctly, the article that featured the syllabus, the $50 kind of clue or carrot was hidden amongst a variety of words that, to be transparent, I likely couldn't pronounce if I attempted to read them all in paragraph format as was presented in the syllabus. And so if I think through, if I'm, a first time in college student, my parents are first generation, I'm a first generation college student, my parents didn't go to college, and I don't know what any of these words mean, I'm probably not going to keep reading because I'm already feeling probably like I don't belong here. and like I'm not going to do well in this class and I don't understand what's happening. So if I continue to keep reading, I'm likely going to kind of go down this rabbit hole of feeling less confident, less secure, less prepared to be here. So I just stop, right? And so I know at SNHU we've done a lot of work with our great faculty partners, and we have some incredible faculty and staff, of course. And so we've done a lot of work just kind of educating a lot of folks on the language that you use and understanding kind of the demographics of the students that are coming to us as incoming, first year students. And that being said, that kind of median student is usually kind of the metric that we use, or the disclaimer. And that varies by institution. And so, I could certainly be making an assumption about, SNHU students versus, I don't remember exactly the college that this professor worked at, but I would find it hard pressed, unless every student that went there got, 1600 on their SATs. Well, I'm showing my age. That's no longer the SAT score, I guess, but it's changed because I took the first one that changed. So I'm like, that's not right. And so the purpose, I have a lot of questions about. It seemed as though the purpose was to simply prove that students don't read the syllabus versus how to get students to read the syllabus, right? And so the overall intent and goal seems to not be aligned with the actual role of the faculty member, right? If we think about what faculty's roles are at an institution, it's to support students in their academic journey and career, and to support them in their career aspirations and whatever that might look like. And there's a variety of different fashions and ways that they can do that. And I use the word adventure a lot because for a lot of students, that's what it is, right? Yeah. And so I certainly had a pinball of my 4.5-year college degree in my undergrad because I transferred, but without some of that guidance that I received, I don't know that I would have graduated, to be honest, and not because I couldn't. There was just a lot of life things happening, and there were so many factors outside of my ability to physically, complete assignments was not the issue. It was all of these other things that were impacting me outside of the classroom, and realistically outside of the institution. And the institution was the thing that was like safe, and what made it safe for me to kind of go and do all of these things. And so if we think about, the world today and all of the things that are impacting our students, there are far more influencers and external, potentially negative factors influencing our students than there were, when I was in college 10, 15 years ago. And so thinking through that, it just raised a lot of questions and concerns about why. And if the intention was to have a student find the $50 and then every student since then would read the syllabus because they thought they'd get $50, I'm still not sold. But that being said, it just raised a lot of questions about intent and purpose, that also stem kind of back to that, like you're asking a question in a way that doesn't actually lead you to the results that you want, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I went down the rabbit hole a little bit.
No, you bring up some really great points, and I think that the first one about the intent is really important. Like, what is the purpose of anything that we're doing, and understanding that and aligning that with our high level purpose, whatever that is, makes a huge impact to how we go about doing things. And certainly I agree with you. The intent was not to entice people to read the syllabus. I think the intent was, I know people aren't going to read the syllabus, and this will be a funny thing that I can post on social media and kind of poke fun at kids.
And how does that make your students feel, right? Like,
right.
It goes back to this interesting question about the purpose that we're here kind of as educators, and I'll loop faculty and staff into the educators bucket, because I'm in the camp that we are all here to be educators, regardless of our role. That being said, it just asks a lot of questions about why, and that intent doesn't seem well intended, right? And I try really hard to assume good intent. Um, and this was something that I really struggled with finding a positive outcome, or a positive intention from, period, to be honest. And like the best I could come up with was someone will find it and then every student might read the syllabus afterwards,
Right.
maybe,
Right.
right? And so I think as we kind of think about our work in education, the alignment of not only those decisions that we make in each of those actions, but also thinking about the alignment of those specific things with our institution or department, kind of depending upon how um, it's broken down at various institutions, kind of rolls back into, or rolls up into, kind of depending on how verticals are done, the overall mission, vision, etc., whichever, which one we want to refer to. But similar to kind of corporate, right? Like if we think about, how is this impacting your customers? Is this a good decision for your customers? There are going to be different conversations about, like, what does it mean to be good for customers? And there's going to be different feelings and thoughts and opinions as to what does good mean, right? And is good enough enough? And we have the same conversations in education about learners and students, right? Like, is this decision good for learners? Is this in the best interest of our learners? And there are people that will say, like, drastically yes, and there are people for the same decision that will say drastically no. And at times they both have valid points. And so how do you find a middle ground to truly understand what does it mean to be good or best for learners, right? And as a math as a math teacher, those good and best are interesting words to use, right? Because we know that it all just depends upon what you're comparing yourself to, right? Like, we know statistics are easily manipulated, and any car company can say they are the best at X, Y, and Z because they are choosing whatever they want to be the best at, and that's what they're going with. They're probably not the best at all these other 150 things, but they don't have to be, because they're only telling you about the 3 that they are the best at. And so I think there's a lot of gray in education and in general, and so it's kind of navigating that gray area and really getting people to have those difficult conversations, and also doing it from a place of true empathy and compassion for not only each other, but the students that are with us, have been with us, such as alumni or prospective students that we know kind of will be there in the future. And this basic understanding of, we're all here for the same reason of, right, supporting these students. And so the article didn't feel good when I read it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm with you there. It brought up a few things, some of which you touched on there. Like, I feel like, number one, if now, to be fair, I haven't looked at a syllabus in 25 years. So let's just put that out there. I barely remember what a syllabus looks like. No, please don't. I don't want anything to do with it. That said, it makes me wonder, number one, do we put too much jargon in a syllabus? So you kind of brought this up about, words in a big paragraph that maybe aren't recognizable to a first-year student, and that may just kind of shut someone down, right? I don't feel like I belong here. All of a sudden, you kind of get this imposter syndrome going. So the words that we use are important. Something that I have been a big fan of, one of the people I'm connected with on LinkedIn, Leslie O'Flavahan, she's a big advocate of plain language, right? And how we communicate things through plain language to have the best possible reach. So I think that's one thing. The other thing that strikes me is, do students actually understand why it's important to read through the syllabus? Or is it important to read through the syllabus? Like that, I think those are questions that need to be answered. And if it's important, okay, great. But if the students don't understand why it's important, they're not going to be motivated to do that. And it doesn't matter if you've got some random carrot, like it's just not going to do it because they don't think it's important.
Yeah, it goes back to like, what is the motivating factor, right? And I was the student through my K-12 education in high school and my master's programs. That was if I don't think this is important, like, I'm not doing it. I was the trouble child in elementary, middle, and high school. That was like, I don't understand. Like, why is this helpful? And when am I going to use this? And why can't I do it this way? Like, that was me forever. And so when I think about students in syllabi, realistically, right? Like, I taught high school math, and in our math classes in high school, like, we had a syllabus and we went through at the beginning of every semester. And so at these two specific high schools that I taught at when I was teaching K-12, I know that students had seen a syllabus. Do I know that any other school had syllabi or used them? No.
Yeah.
Do I know that it looked the same or that it contained the same stuff? I don't, right? Like, I know what I did as the math teacher in high school. And I know what I do as a math, as an adjunct math faculty, at SNHU. But there's also a lot of differences between what would have been in a syllabus in high school and what would have been in a syllabus in college, right? So if we think just basically about like any type of accommodation students need, or like 504 accommodations, or for learning differences, that type of thing. In high school, those were for the most part dictated for them and given to them by virtue of conversations with parents, guardians, family members, etc., whoever was their kind of designated person. Whereas in college, like, you don't just get that. Like, you have to physically go tell another human, like, hi, I'm so-and-so, Shanna, and I have epilepsy and I have a concentration disorder. And so here's my medical documentation that, like, I need accommodations. And then they have to review all of your stuff and then say, like, yes or no, and then give you an accommodation. And then in some places, like, the student then has to share those accommodations with their various faculty members themselves. And so, like, just that one process of how to receive the accommodations that I'm legally entitled to as per law, right, are so different from this one experience to another. But who tells them these things? Right? Other than your syllabus that says, like, if you need accommodations, please see this office. But to that point, do students know where that office is? Do they know what that means? Do they know what the word accommodations means? They may not even know what that word, like, and so it's thinking through, how do you make that important? And how do you make students understand the importance of something when you know that it's so widely variable across the board, whether that's in, a K-12 setting or that's in a higher ed setting, right? Because faculty have, most institutions have very, there's like specific policies that need to go in their syllabi, and they have to have, the room number and the days their class meets and very basic information. And some policies about, academic integrity and accommodations, and like, there's like a handful of things that have to be in there. And then what else goes in there is faculty, is ability for faculty to kind of use their freedom as they may. And so there are faculty who could have a 10-page syllabus, and there are faculty that can have a 1-page syllabus, depending upon where they land and what that looks like. And so how do you get the why across for the 1-page syllabus, and then also share the why for the 10-page syllabus? And those whys could be the same, but they could also be very different. And so students are now juggling the, like, well, why is this so different from here to here? And why is everything not similar? And so it's just a very different environment that they're frankly not used to. And how do we kind of get them accustomed to that in a rapid iteration way, that kind of is is the magic question, right? That every school probably internationally has struggled to kind of figure out, how do you best support students transitioning from high school to college, who struggle with that transition, because it is so different, right? And you're now away from home and have the freedom of time, and you have to choose whether you get up, or you have to choose to go to class. And if you don't go, no one's calling your house, and no one is, doing these other things that would have happened, right? So the consequences are more severe, right? Because you are paying money and not going. But what are those levers that you can pull to then get students to understand the importance of various things once they're already here, right? Because you can tell them it's important, but how do you get them to actually know and understand? And then how do you measure that they do know and understand, is kind of the back end of that question.
Yeah, I have to assume that it is easily lost on the people that are dealing with it every day, right? The faculty and the staff at a university. But I'm sure, like a great many things, right, it's easy to forget about. But in particular, for those first year students, it's such a drastic change. Like, everything changes. Like, it's like we just, here, go adult. You go to university and you go adult and you figure it out. And your entire experience of life is changed. I think back to when I was, and it's hard because it's so long ago for me to remember when I was a freshman in college, but you're living here on your own for the first time. You're right. I have to set my alarm. Nobody's going to yell at me for not getting up on time. If I decide I just don't want to go to class, I just don't go to class, right? Maybe I decide I got better things to do, or maybe I'm out all night partying, and like that 8 a.m. calculus class, I'm just like, no, I don't think so. Not happening today. Like, those are all things that you can do. Meanwhile, you are paying an enormous sum, particularly today. It was less so when I went to school, but school is really expensive today. You're paying an enormous sum of money for this education and this experience, often without having a full understanding of like how much money that actually is. Like, you don't have a concept of how much debt you may actually be getting into if you're taking on student loans, because you just haven't ever had to deal with that before.
Yeah, I mean, I was a math major. I double majored in math and education, and I graduated with 6 figures of student loan debt and didn't understand what that meant. And like, I was good at math, but like, I didn't know how to factor loans. No one had ever taught me what loans, other than like, I have to pay them back. Like, I understood that part. I knew that it wasn't free money. So I was like already ahead of some of my counterparts there. But I didn't understand interest rates and what that actually meant and how much money I was going to have to pay eventually. In my first teaching job out of college, my contract was for $29,000 a year. And I thought that was like millions, because I didn't know. I had made, $6 an hour at the ice rink as a skate monitor, for public skate and handing out skate rentals. And I worked at like a gas station during college, making like $8, I think. Like, so to me, $29,000 a year sounded like a lot of money. And it was at the time, right? And so, then it was like, oh, you have to find a place to live. And, thankfully, like, my mom was like, it shouldn't be more than 30% of your, the traditional, rule of thumb, not more than 30% of your take home pay. And I was like, so I have to find a place to live for $400. And I was like, okay, nope, like, didn't panic yet. And then I looked online, rent.com or Craigslist or wherever I looked. And of course, there was literally nothing for $400, unless I wanted to rent a very questionable like motel room. And I had this like moment of like, wait, like, I did all of the things I was supposed to do. No one has told me that like this is what was going to happen. And I now like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know where I'm going to live. And like, I just signed this contract to work at this place doing at the time what I thought was like my dream job. And I'm over 100 grand in debt for this question mark. And it was this like moment of, wait, like, I feel like I just got bamboozled. And then it just asked the question of like, whose job is it to have that conversation, right? Like, should I have done more research? Neither of my parents went to college. And so they did. It was really important for them for that I went. And so obviously I did. But they didn't know what teachers made out of school. Like, they thought teaching was like a great job, and has great benefits. Like, that's what they knew, right? And so thinking about what that looks like and what it means, and knowing that when I looked, I made, I think, like $1,200 or $1,500 over the Section 8 is our like housing authority in New Hampshire, and so over like the Section 8 maximum limit to receive like state assistance. I was like, this is a full-time job. I don't understand. But like, a good job. I've been told my whole life this is a good job. And now I'm in this place of, I've done all of the things, and now what do I do? And so obviously I made it work for a handful of years, and hence the very quick to sign up for a master's program because I needed more money. And so it was just this feeling of like, what happened, like this blur of, I just did all of these things. I did everything I was supposed to do, and it got me to this point. Now what do I do? Right. And so it asked the question, as I mentioned earlier, like, whose job is that? Right. Like, whose job is it to tell students like what those income expectations are, depending upon, and it's very different by state and by district. Right. So like, I recognize I accepted a contract at one of the lower paying districts in the state of New Hampshire, which I will admit. But I didn't know that, right? Like, I didn't know what was a good district and what was a higher paying district. And also I was right out of college. So it was a teaching job, and I was like, yay, woo. And so it's questions that we still haven't answered as an industry, right? If we think about the role of institutions and the role of colleges, the perception of institutions from the public versus the perceptions of institutions from themselves, there's a drastic mismatch between what those perceptions are. And there's been a bunch of studies, I don't have them offhand, but that have shown that public perception in higher ed has been declining steadily, over the last 5 to 10 years. And institutions are now viewed as part of the problem rather than part of the solution, due to the rising costs and kind of what that means. And there's a lot of things obviously that factor into that perception. And the industry, for the most part, has said like, well, that's just not true. And continue to go about their business as if things are, normal and fine, when we know that every year there are, dozens and dozens of small institutions closing because they can't financially sustain their current models. And so at what point do we say like, okay, like, this isn't working and we need to shift gears, and what does that look like? And so the pandemic has sped some of that up, I think, for some of the institutions, just due to out of necessity, for some of the financial pieces, because that really hurt a lot of institutions, as you can imagine, right? As it hurt a lot of kind of industries and corporations across the globe. But what that looks like in the future, I don't know. But I think education has long needed some shifts, not only in kind of practices, but also in it starts with the mindsets and perceptions of the folks that work there, and the folks that are able to make those decisions and kind of make things priorities. Because that's the first thing that has to happen, is we have to believe that change is necessary, and that change is not a bad thing or a detractor for our students. And so if we can all get on the same page about what it means for our students and the why behind what we're attempting to do, then are we really going to be successful, right? And the same is true if we think of kind of our corporate friends in the CS space, right? Like, if we're trying to implement a new product for our customers, whether it's in the education space, or I know, Rob, you work in the enablement space, and only 25% of your folks are on board, like out of the gate, you know it's likely not going to be successful, because you're going to have people who are probably going out of their way to make it not successful because they don't agree with why it's happening. And so how do we turn the dial on the folks who are detracting from the initiative, while also like moving forward and kind of seeing the industry as a whole look to be better and want to be better, right? When we know that there's some places that don't see an issue.
Yeah, well, the good news is there's a huge opportunity, I think, in front of all universities. And I'm glad there are people like you out there kind of leading the charge, because it's definitely an important thing. And you're right, the way that people perceive higher ed today is different than it was from when I was a kid, and not in a good way. And so the more that we can work towards making sure that those expectations are aligned, and that we're servicing the customer, which is the learner in this case, and trying to have the best outcomes for them, the more successful everyone will be at that. So
yeah, I totally agree. I think it's taking the student experience and not replacing it with the customer, right? Because I think that's where a lot of the disagreements have come from, right? And it's really breaking it into the learner experience and the customer experience, and having it be a kind of a twofold approach.
It's been so great having you on. Thank you so much, Shana. I appreciate your time today. And I look forward to talking to you again, because you opened some cans of worms that we didn't even have a chance to get to. So
yes, Rob, I would love to come back, and I would love to keep our conversation going. So thank you so much for today. I really appreciated it.
well, thank you.